Hello. Here's a look at the power of specifics with A. LaFay. There's an urban legend that Ernest Hemingway was challenged to write a story in 6 words. There's no proof that he wrote the line we're about to discuss, but it's a great example of the power of specifics. Let me share this story with you slowly, and let's explore how it changes. It helps if you don't read ahead. It is a story about shoes. Are you interested? What if it's a story about baby shoes? Does that make it more interesting? What if they're for sale and unused? Notice how much this story changes and becomes more powerful and more promising by the details that are added. For sale, baby shoes, never used. Why weren't they used? Does it mean someone bought baby shoes in hopes of an impending birth and the baby was never born? How sad. On the other hand, it could be that they bought the baby shoes and the baby never wore the shoes because it grew too fast and never had a chance to wear them. There are 100 of different possibilities hiding inside specifics. So, it's important to remember that specific detail can change everything. For instance, it would really help if I had changed a detail of adding an S right here. But let's look at it specifically in the short story Marzipan by Roberta Allen. So, here's the story. It's short and will be a quick read. And as we go along, I'm going to look at the specific details that are added. At a crowded party, a pretty girl closes her eyes and bites into a marzipan pear, a look of rapture on her face. I just love marzipan, she says to the tipsy young Englishman beside her. Notice, it's not just a party, it's a crowded party, and it's a pretty girl. And she doesn't just take a dessert, she takes a marzipan that's shaped like a pear, and her response is rapture. These specific details bring us into the moment and make us see how she feels. She's saying this to a tipsy young Englishman beside her. The details here change everything. It's not just a tipsy person, it's a tipsy young Englishman. The haughty young man who seems to be posing, haughty, young, posing, says with a mocking smile, Balzac loved marzipan too. His bright blue eyes intrigue her. There was once a rumor in Paris that he opened a candy store just to sell marzipan. But the truth was, Balzac always bought marzipan from the same shop. There is a mischievous gleam in his eye. For a while, crowds swarmed to this store to sample the sweet. Here we have details that imply he's a learned person and knows Balzac. And that people are easily swayed by celebrities. Even then. Did you just make that up? Asked the girl. First we hear her words, and then we learn her mouth is full. This changes things. The specifics alter the story a little. It's a true story, the young man replies. What a silly story, laughs the girl, taking another marzipan fruit from the dish on the table. She likes his curly hair. She wonders what's behind his mocking smile. How do you know such a silly story? She asks. I'm a poet and a food lover, the young man says, half serious. When I tire of poetry, I read the food encyclopedia just for fun. Now, these details, that he's a poet and a food lover who writes poetry and reads food encyclopedias just for fun, tells us a lot about who he is. Moving on. As the girl laughs, licks her sticky fingers, and chooses another marzipan morsel, the poet glances at the other guests. After quickly appraising the girls, he turns back to the one beside him. I'd like to point out that this story will abruptly change shortly, and I want you to realize and think about what these specific details the story has shared already tells you about what this story is really about. And let's see how things change once that volta appears. A volta is a change in a poem or a story, or even a film, that abruptly changes the way we see the entire thing. How do you stay so thin? He asks, as she toys with a marzipan apple. Metabolism, I guess. I never gain weight. She lies. What other silly stories can you tell me? She says to change the subject. He pauses for a moment, swaying slightly. His every move seems mannered, artificial. He plays a role, but he knows he plays it well. I know so many stories, he smiles. During the blockade of Malta by the English and the Neapolitans, the people had nothing to eat but domestic animals like dogs, cats, rats, and donkeys. In time they came to prefer donkey meat over beef and veal. He raises his brows and waits for her to reaction. That's an awful tale, she laughs, as she munches on another piece of marzipan. Tell me another. For a moment, the poet seems to have lost his memory. His mind goes blank, as he stares into the distance. His mocking smile disappears. Suddenly he blurts out, My mother killed herself in 1978. The girl looks at him, surprised. The man turns a deep shade of pink and lowers his eyes. He wonders what came over him. I'm so sorry, says the girl, removing her hand from the candy dish. So am I, says the man, who knows he's ruined his performance. He feels the curtain falling on his stage. The scent of the almond-flavored sweet, however, stirs his memory. He suddenly recalls how much his mother loved marzipan. Angry at himself, he avoids the girl's eyes as he thinks about these hours wasted in the library searching for stories to use as parties, where he feels shy, where he really meets girls, where he's so afraid someone will see how much he's been hurt. As he turns to walk away, he tosses a piece of marzipan into his mouth, but its taste gives him no pleasure. See how things drastically change because of one detail about this man. His own mother killed herself in 1978, most likely when this man was a boy. So it raises the question, how does everything change because of one specific detail? Suddenly, this becomes a lot more than a pickup story at a party. It's a story about a character who is flawed and hurt and seeking connection, and doing it in a way that's not revealing the truth, either of him or of the person he's talking to. And I wonder what would happen if he had told her the truth. Also, notice the intense details in this last paragraph and how much is revealed about him through the details that are used. So, let's talk about details. We learn that they give us vicarious experiences as we read. We can almost taste that marzipan pear. We get a strong sense of this young man's sense of hurt and separation and difference. And we know how much it affects him because of how he freezes in time before he reveals that hidden truth. It also builds realism and allows us to be drawn into the story. Interestingly enough, the girl tests the realism of this story when she asks, is that story true? But those same details also allow us to see that this story is most likely based on realism, a realism that we ourselves have experienced in one way or another at a party, meeting someone, and learning something about ourselves or about the person we're speaking to that we didn't expect. So it builds backstory, it builds motivation. It shows us why this young man puts on a front to try and pick up girls and connect with people. It shows contrasting traits, that this girl eats 3 marzipan, tells him her metabolism means she never gains weight, but it's a lie. We also learn inner and outer motivations. The outer motivation of this young man is to pick up this girl. And in reality, it's an inner motivation of needing to feel connected to another human being in a way he has not been able to do since his mother killed herself. So, these are great examples of how specifics have great power. And so then a lot of times we wonder, okay, so if specifics have power, how do we then take what we've learned about specifics and apply them to our own writing? So I thought I would give you an example of how that can be done by looking at a short story of mine called Passing Down. I've worked for years to try and get this piece of flash fiction published, and it wasn't until last spring that I finally placed it. So let's look at what changed. Version 1 of this story starts like this. Passing Down. Oh, it's also 540 words originally. Well, not originally. I've done multiple changes. And I apologize that my screen is going to cut off a word or two. I'm not some used car salesman you can bargain with, Muriel. Edna pointed the knife, seeing her sister's left eye perched on the tip. So getting some fuzzy dice over the mirror is out of the question. Muriel, Edna pressed the knife into the cutting board. That bedroom suite wasn't just our mother's. It was her mother's before her. It needs to be passed down. It'd be passing down to me. Who gets it after that? Pedro? That bird will outlast me by 25 years easy. He's always loved dark woods. Setting her shoulders, Edna says, It'll go to me, then to Marianne. Who is Edna's daughter, which you find out later. So here's an example of how the story started. We do have some details. We know almost instantly that these two characters are at odds. We know that Edna is probably a little more prim and proper, and Muriel a little more sarcastic and dark. We also know that Edna is doing the dishes, and that Muriel has a bird named Pedro, and that there's someone named Marianne in the mix, and that their mother is dead, and that the furniture bedroom suite she had in her bedroom during her lifetime came from their grandmother. Let's look at how things changed. Number one, we are now up to 960 words. I'm not some used car salesman you can bargain with, Muriel. Edna pointed the knife, balancing her sister's left eye, perched on the tip. So getting some fuzzy dice over the mirror is out of the question. Muriel ranked arguments right up there with colonoscopies, and ever since she'd chosen a tour of the country via a used VW bus over college 4 decades earlier, her sister Edna acted like she'd been promoted to eldest in the family because she hadn't shirked her duties. She'd like to shirk something, all right. Suddenly she remembered her mother standing at the window of the van, handing her the only camera in the family. Take them everywhere you go. Send a few home when you can. And that was her mother's goodbye as she stepped back and waved before returning to the house, while her dad finished a last-minute engine check, like she was preparing for takeoff. Spying her mother's photo album tucked sideways on a bottom shelf in Edna's living room, Muriel shook her head, thinking, I must have taken a million shots with that thing. Why didn't I send more to Mom? Her mom had packed the photo of her waving from the tunnel of a giant sequoia had kept the photo of her waving from the tunnel of a giant sequoia on the fridge for nearly a decade. Muriel. Edna pressed the knife into the cutting board, bringing her back to this tiff over furniture, a bunch of wood glued together in useful ways. That bedroom suite wasn't just our mother's. It was her mother's before her. It needs to be passed down. It'd be passed down to me. And Lord knows she needed some furniture. Her place was so empty, she was getting sick of the echo every time she headed to the kitchen. Who gets it after that? Pedro? Edna huffed. That bird will outlast me by 25 years. He's always loved dark woods. Setting her shoulders, Edna said, It'll go to me, then to Marianne. Notice what changed here is details. Lots of them. We learn a lot more about Muriel and Edna, about their past lives, how they feel about fighting, the type of relationship Muriel had with her mother, the way Muriel really feels about furniture. We don't learn as much about Edna, but as you'll learn through the course of the story, this story is really about Muriel and what Muriel learns about things that are passed down. So notice how the details that I shared here or added here really change the context of this story. The level of specificity changed. I added backstory, sensory details, like the echo of her apartment when she walked through it because it didn't have much furniture in it, and character motivation. We learn a lot more about how Muriel is trying to reconnect to her past and her mother. Explore the power of specifics in your own writing. How can changes add more emotion, bring out character development or depth, expand the vicarious experience of the reader through sensory details? To test this out, take a scene from a story or a stanza from a poem and add, change, remove details to see how it changes the meaning and depth of the work. The more you look at the power of detail, the more you gain control over them. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope you enjoy this tight right bite from Ayla Faye. Right on!